Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Roger Spitz. I started my career as an investment banker, and I'm now seeking forgiveness and redemption. So for close to 20 years, I was advising CEOs, board members, shareholders on strategic either mergers and acquisitions or venture capital investments primarily. And what fascinated me a few years ago is that I was starting to see the gap between the investments being made and in real life and the acquisitions being made and the narratives around science fiction. That gap was narrowing more and more. And so very intentionally, a lot of the VCs were looking for investments in areas which were, in the past, really pure science fiction or close enough. So seeing the speed and scale of change and disruption over the years, I've refocused myself into what is now, I've full-time and professionalized Foresight strategy through Tech Essential, which is my own setup. But until recently, I was effectively coming from the corporate side. So the topic we chose today for you with Tim is really looking at how science fiction is used and can be used as a business tool effectively. So I know that I'm speaking last, so a lot of today, all of this and some of these areas might have been covered, but I just wanted to start with one of the things which I find most fascinating around how close the narrative or the science fiction stories are in relation to what we're living. And that is the case, obviously, for the sort of non-corporate world, but it's also very much the case for the business and corporate world. Anecdotally, I find it very interesting on the past tense in Star Trek, with the 3 crew members which were beamed down to Earth and then accidentally, and 2 of them were arrested in San Francisco in the 2024 past for being homeless and dumped into the sanctuary zone. The 3rd one, who was held by a tech billionaire who founded media platforms on the interface, obviously today the internet, and made a lot of money from government data mining contracts. So within all that story, which many of you will know probably inside out and better than I will, to exist, there was a need to ensure that the riots arose, which triggered some political events, which gave then rise to the Federation. And when you look at these kind of narratives, you see how closely and how eerie it is to, to some of the things happening today. I know there was a dedicated session, and much of today was around looking at the various science fiction narratives and stories and how they panned out many years later. These are selection. There are obviously hundreds, and that's very well covered. But I still wanted to preface it with, before moving into the core topic, I still wanted to look at how important that imagination and those creative stories have been for things which have materialized further down the line. And so as we kick into the topic, what I wanted to do with you now is really just look at a research piece which was carried out by Philip Jordan and a number of other eminent academic and professors, who some of them from the University of Hawaii, who reviewed all of the papers since 1982 for science fiction related terminology from the ACM conference on human factors in computer sciences. And so in their findings, they sought out and looked for all of the terms and features around human-computer interactions. And so I find that very interesting, because the graph, which hopefully you can see on the screen, it really, it's actually very visual. If you take one of the most important conferences on these type of events, and if you take the work from Philip Jordan and team on exploring the referral and usage of science fiction in human-computer interactions literature, you can see the, explosion is a bit strong, but certainly you can see the exponential curve as it gets closer to today. So what are the findings? The findings are, number 1, science fiction plays a very significant role. Number 2, it's mentioned more and more frequently. And I think the important point is that this is just anecdotal. It's really just the tip of the iceberg. So only a fraction of the actual inspiration and impact of science fiction is captured here. And when you then move into the realm of the business world and the technology world, all this is actually very much of an inspiration and very helpful to explore new forms of human-computer interface. And that's where the business world and the technology comes in. So I wanted to start with some obvious topics, but just to connect the dots and to make the linkage between the imagination side and innovation. We all know how difficult it is for large companies in particular, even more so incumbent and legacy companies in their respective industries, to be, disruptive in terms of innovation, to really come up with something new. And it's, these are just a few subsectors and a few logos, but effectively, when you look at the automotive industry, when you look at the food industry, payments, space, telecommunications, and one can name many others, you all have very established industries with very established incumbent legacy players. And I'm not even talking here about new industries in cybernetics. I'm not talking about new subsegments which have only emerged more recently or been commercialized more recently. I'm looking at industries which for some of them have been around for decades, some others probably longer. So automotive, it's interesting why none of the the OEMs, none of whether it's the big European automotive players or the US, were able to come up with the more cutting edge areas, which had to be taken over by the likes of Google or Uber or Tesla. How come in the food industry no one was able to be as creative as now? I think combined they've got a bit of a hit, but it's probably close to 10 billion valuation for Beyond Food and Impossible, compared to the likes of Tyson, Foods, or others who have been around for forever. In the payments industry, how come the First Datas of the world and many of the big infrastructure payment technology players were unable to think about what is now some of these companies are worth literally hundreds of billions of dollars and didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago, and financial in China, for instance, or a few tens of billions, the Squares and Stripes or Adyen of this world with online payments or e-commerce. In space, why wasn't Boeing or EADS at the time, Airbus, capable of commercializing some of the equipment and launchers in space, which a Blue Origin or SpaceX is doing at a more cost-effective level? Why does the NASA need to rely on more sort of less established players, in a sense? And not to mention telecommunications, who for so many years relied on the cash cows on text messaging and international calls, and who left basically the over-the-top and new emergent technologies to emerging players like Skype or WeChat, WhatsApp or Zoom. So this is really the link for me with science fiction. This is really, in a way, if you take a step back, why there's a desperation for survival for these corporates to stay relevant, to stay legitimate and exist when emerging players are eating their lunch every day, as to how can they stay innovative and how are they not able within the realm of their usual strategic toolboxes of cutting it. And so in a sense, that introduces science fiction from a business and a corporate perspective as a sandbox for innovation. So that gives them two things, I guess. One is an external perspective, and the second one is that it's unconstrained. There's no limit to the external perspectives and external views which companies are getting. They are advised by countless strategy consultants of all sorts, the McKinseys and Bains and all of these guys, and a lot of the investment banks and all sorts. But oftentimes it's still within a pretty formulaic, cookie cutter playbooks. And so science fiction, it gives an opportunity to look at alternative realities, debatable as to how plausible or not, but certainly alternative. Paradoxically, more about the present than the future, and where there is the scope for imagination to become reality. So what types of companies use science fiction? Interestingly enough, you'll obviously see the usual suspects on the technology side. and you'll see many other players which are not on the technology side. Because ultimately, although a lot of the articles and a lot of the spin around how business uses science fiction often revolves around technology innovation and specific products. But ultimately, innovation is nothing more than how does a company stay relevant? And that relevance is often taking a different perspective from what they're currently doing. So Hershey's, for instance, whether it's around 3D printing of chocolates, whether it's the likes of Visa, who are looking to push their thinking, to open their eyes to experiential technology, to different methods, different approaches, to bring alive tangible exhibits and their stories around what is the future of commerce, what is the future of payments, how will society live and behave and use those enabling technologies around payments, for instance. I think many of you might have followed some of the developments of Lowe's, which is quite interesting, especially I've seen many on the line, Kathy, hello, and others around AR, VR, and everything else. Lowe's is a good example with the living labs in terms of technology, using spatial computing, AR, VR, to have that experiential side. And they've also, I think, with partnered up with Made in Space, Lowe's has sent a 3D printer to space, looking at the next stages of a possible exploration, which is gaining intensity around outside of the Earth. And so these are all areas and all companies who use these tools. So there are many different reasons to use science fiction as a tool, but I would like to just spend a minute focusing on the different constituents of what is the imagination and what is innovation for corporate. I think the first element, and this is where a lot of the Foresight industry has the debate with the business world, which is, imagination can be a key strategic asset which can beat analysis. It's very difficult when you have one of your main constituents as a company, which are shareholders, with required returns, with things that are very measurable. And I was into your discussion, Jim, and others, fascinating around the sort of investment cycle and return side. It's difficult when things are not quantified, when it's not an analysis, where you can't estimate things to really allow some of these initiatives to take place. But of course, many of the companies understand how important that side of the imagination is. And we all know, for those who follow Nassim Taleb and his various writings, that the whole exercise of risk analysis and extrapolating and modelizing has its limitations, to say the least. It opens doors in terms of starting conversations you might not otherwise have had. The whole ideation process, which many of you will be very intimately familiar with, around inventing the different possibilities. It also injects a bit of crazy. We all know in innovation that an idea is crazy until only until such time that it becomes reality and that people embrace it, right? The outside view we talked about, reframing the different perceptions, exploring different products, different IP, technologies, and going through the whole process of exploring the social impact of that. And to do that in a way, because ultimately, you could argue it's a pretty cheap tool, you can do that in a way that's unconstrained. There's no financial technology barrier that hampers your creativity as you're building those stories. So if we move on from just the pure creativity and innovation side, there's a piece which is, and I think, Tim, you alluded to this as to one of the biggest questions, the what if, simply. It allows you to challenge, whether you're asking the right questions, whether you're having the right assumptions that your company or whatever product is built on. There's a piece of it which is a Foresight tool. You're reconciling that very complicated area, which is, how do you reconcile short-term and long-term strategic thinking, especially in a world which is very volatile, very unstable, very complex, and very ambiguous. Today's VUCA world, where disruption is increasing, where change is, the speed and scale of change is very significant. How do you reconcile with such lack of visibility, short and long-term thinking? It provides an element of systems thinking, looking at the next order implications. Some of the areas Leah and others talked about around, science fiction prototyping, theoretical design research. And there's a whole piece around the important narrative, how important, I think personally, increasingly these days with the, social media and other social factors, the storytelling. And then there's a cultural piece and the retrocasting. And last but not least, and this is obviously one of the most important areas, right? Especially if you think about from a Silicon Valley and a technology perspective, it's a platform for the ethical debate and guidelines, whether it's, well, you guys are intimately aware of all of these and the sort of platforms for the debate, many of these, eerily close to today's reality. But, the paradigms around iRobot, the areas around the, thinking about what it means for artificial intelligence, what guidelines one should have, where, Asimov as 60, 70 years ago was already putting in frameworks around this healthy discussion, which isn't, only just beginning in ways. One area which hopefully the companies and the corporates are not using science fiction too much for is as a real prediction tool. I think we all know that that the purpose of science fiction and of foresight certainly is not to predict the future. And as Alan Toffler said, predicting the future is left for television oracles and newspaper astrologers. Even though, just sort of reflecting on that, I do find it interesting the extent to which, paradoxically, even though that isn't or shouldn't be the attention, so much of what is happening is actually, in a way, you could argue was predicted, quote unquote, from science fiction. So we can see that there's a kind of paradoxical relationship between the predictability or otherwise. Some resources, and I think these are just examples from a practical perspective of organizations, and there are many others, and apologies if there are people on the call or others, which are obvious names I should have mentioned, but multiverse design, we had Leah with a very interesting talk early on around world building, organizations like DX Lab in San Francisco, Sci-Fi Futures, of course, in LA, and then the uncommon partners with Carl at Singularity, and some of the the things that UC San Diego and Arizona State University are doing with their own centers of around imagination and that. So these are areas which are concretely organizations which have an advisory role, a consulting role around some of these topics. So we talked about how all of this is directly linked to shaping the future, intentional or not. We can see that there's a correlation there. And so the question is, should we be worrying about that? Is it worrisome? The gap between science fiction and science faction is reducing. There's a Silicon Valley design fiction where things are going, concretely pretty much every day from ideation to the market. And ultimately, science fiction does play a large part in how the future is shaped. Whether that's intentional or not is something we need to think about. We all know how much Elon and a lot of Silicon Valley, and not just Silicon Valley, but in China as well, and Israel and many other places, there's certain visions which are very heavily influenced, if not inspired, by science fiction. And we also know, just anecdotally, that the Netflix does probably about over 15 billion of content of its own content, and that its most popular and increasing segment within that, which is about a third of its viewings, is about, and productions, is science fiction and fantasy. So this is a very significant area which is growing of interest. Now, rather than just looking at a few areas or talking conceptually, one thing I like to do, and 20 years as an advisor working on many of these deals, is to follow the money. Where is the mergers and acquisitions? Where is the venture capital money actually going? And these are just a few examples, and I think Jim mentioned one or two of them already, but I'll kind of reframe them in the context. But I think it's spot on. When you look at where the actual cash is going, there is a sci-fi-like element to it. So whether you're looking at haptics, which raised a bit of money last year, which are effectively allowing you with telerobotic system to transmit touch feedback to an operator anyway. Quite clunky today and not perfect, but it gives an indication as to the direction where things are going. When you're looking at Mojo Vision, which has raised over 100 million funding, like one or two of you on the call, maybe I looked at potentially investing earlier this year, decided not to, but effectively it's an augmented reality contact lens, right? So it allows, it's quite interesting. It's micro LED technology. It claims to be the smallest and densest dynamic display delivering pixel density that exists, right? So it's 300 times greater than the current smartphone displays and a bunch of other features in terms of a fraction of the power usage, etc. And the interesting thing is that concretely, there's tens of millions of dollars, and for some areas, hundreds of millions of dollars being invested in by the venture capital community in these businesses. Of course, the brain-computer interface area is a fascinating one. Before talking about Facebook, and when you think about Black Mirror's Bandersnatch and some other areas, the two very interesting Israeli companies I've come across, which I haven't put here, who are very involved on the sort of cybernetic side, which raised funding over the past 2 years. One is ArcTops, which is an AI-based platform which constructs effectively a multi-dimensional map of real-time brain activity. And the second one, and immediately you'll have a number of movies that spring to mind just by listening to the description, which is Core Actions, which is developing non-invasive software platforms which identifies human intentions to prevent disastrous human-machine interface errors. So this is non-invasive software that is effectively, meant to anticipate human actions. So you can see where all this is going. Now, Facebook, and they're not alone, have invested considerably. So there's the acquisition which they made, obviously, of Control Labs, which is a neural interface platform. Initially, it's Impulse Armband, but directionally, we know that this is possibly a precursor to other impulses and to brain-computer interface. We know that Facebook has a strategic partnership with Ray-Ban and Luxottica. Luxottica, one of the largest glasses and glass manufacturers in the world, and that effectively the idea is they're designing specs which can allow you to take calls and interact with augmented reality. And Oculus itself, which is dematerializing sensors, controllers, and dematerializing the smartphone itself. So you can see where this is going. If you have either glasses or a lens which is interacting directly, on brain-computer interface, which you can speak to in order to make calls, but which can also read your brain, and you don't need a smartphone, or you're not the one giving the instructions, it's drawing it directly, and that communication is taking place. It doesn't take much for the imagination in terms of where this can go and how closely related it is to elements of science fiction already. So the question on science fiction and science fact is a very concrete one for businesses, because there are entire industries with tens of billions of dollars, if not hundreds of billions of dollars, which are being shaped and which are taking into account some of these elements. And science fiction is in a way helping these organizations, these companies, think about what the future might look like, how they want to play a role in that, and what technologies to develop in that. So when you're looking at, for instance, the convergence of 5G, Internet of Things, sensors, everything around augmented, virtual reality, mixed reality, artificial intelligence, that in its own right is quite an interesting piece. When you look at natural language processing and the investments and developments in some of the chips, some of these very phenomenal Israeli companies around AI chips, where the artificial intelligence and machine learning is going. Where you're looking at artificial reality, is it in real virtual life or in virtual real life that you're looking at, or that you'll be looking at in the future, and how science fiction is that? We talked about brain-computer interface, we talked about brain-to-brain communications, And we talked a bit about being able to see, hear, and feel with a human-machine interface, a computer tech meets the wearables. With breakthroughs and significant investments in multiple companies around materials technology, around holographic displays, you're entering a new nano world where the breakthroughs in some of the materials technology are enabling this to take place, as well as the low power processing. I've also kind of, I don't know if it exists or not, but I put an abbreviation which I call DEIP, D-E-I-P, which is as things move towards being delocalized, experiential, immersive, and personalized, how close is that to a lot of science fiction? How much is science fiction helping companies craft that? You're then leading all this to the question around cyberspace. And I think you mentioned, Tim, just before the break now, around time travel, around what would be the inconvenience or the advantage of time travel. But when you look at some of these technologies we just talked about and concrete investment taking place around haptics, where you can see, hear, and feel potentially remotely, how far is that from digital teleportation or potential space travel or time travel? And so as we wrap up, I'll leave you with a quote of Michio Kaku, whom no doubt a lot of you will be also very huge fans of. But effectively, his line is, once confined to fantasy and science fiction, time travel is now simply an engineering problem. So that brings to an end the few ideas I wanted to share with you in terms of how science fiction is used by business as a key tool, why that is, one or two of the things to think about, and the directions this could be leading to.